So as Alex mentioned, I wasn't supposed to be here, and I'm not Glenn. Thank you. Alex did suggest she was going to shout fake Glenn as I got up. At some point, I've got to look forward to it. So fortunately, I have a few talks in the back pocket, so to speak, but I think I last gave this one about a year ago. So there might be a slide come up that I don't know is going to be there, and I'll have to remember. So apologies for the sudden spillage and faffing around as and when it comes up. So I'm going to hit reset. It's a double, I think, in Alex terminology, so we're going to stop about 20 minutes-ish. There'll be a nice orange slide that says pint time, and then we'll come back and we'll do the second half. Questions whenever, I don't mind. Typically they're normally at the end, but it doesn't matter. So, as Alex has already said, the title is definitely still How a Vulnerability Management Programme Can Help Your Organisation. And it doesn't matter really the size of your organisation, because everybody has still got a vulnerability somewhere. I'm looking particularly at IT type vulnerabilities. You might have a rubbish lock on your front door. I'm a little bit less worried, but depends on what you've got coming in. So let's crack on, he says, as the clicker does not work. There we go. So we're going to start with what a vulnerability is. And I'm going to have to look behind me because on there it's really small. So I'm not going to read all of them, just the quotes. So a vulnerability is a weakness or exposure in a technology, protocol or design of an information technology system such as hardware, firmware and software. And if you've studied for a CISP or any of ISC2's qualifications, that's their definition. So it could be a bug in a piece of software. It could be a problem with some configuration. Or it could just be that you have literally left the lock off the front door, depending on what you're looking at. So this is a lot of the stuff that I have to do with my day-to-day job. I'm a senior information security officer. I look at the software that we write. I look at the software that we use, be that a Microsoft product, an Amazon product, any other product. Stuff has to come through me. I give it a security review, and I have to keep an eye on vulnerabilities because if we get bitten by one, so to speak, someone's going to come knocking on my door. So I have to keep an eye on those, and we'll cover some of the ways that you can do that a little bit later on. And I mentioned already about risks, and vulnerabilities tie into risks. You could have as many vulnerabilities as you like, but if no one can ever get to the thing with the vulnerability, you don't really have a risk. We all agree on that one? If you were the only car on the road, the risk of you being hit by another car is zero. You might still knock it off the road or throw it over a cliff or something, but you won't get hit by another car. So we have to think a lot about risk. And a lot of the time, this will mean that we take our knowledge of the systems that we're using and how people interact with them, and that might change how vulnerability works. So ISC2, they were ISC squared when I wrote this last year, but they're now ISC2, define a risk as the possibility of damage or harm and a likelihood that that damage or harm will be realised. So there are different formulas for this. Sometimes it's likelihood versus impact. Different places use different ways of calculating risk. I don't sit there and work out a nice numerical number for it. I will just have an idea of what the business is doing and say, right, this is the risk of this thing. I will use some numbers, but I'm not going to come out and give them, well, it's a 4.5. I don't need to calculate that. There's other schemes to do that. So it could be that the risk is the possibility someone will exploit a bug. So they will take the vulnerability, they will find a way of attacking you through that vulnerability, which is the exploit itself, and they will use that to do something that you don't want them to do, not what the system is designed for. So vulnerability management is basically keeping on top of all of those vulnerabilities so you've got an idea of what's going on and you can reduce the risk. So in order to do this, you really need to know what you've got to start with. So has anybody here got the lovely job of managing an asset register? Is that any of you? Is that just me? Excellent. At least one other person knows my pain then. Ever find stuff that you didn't know that existed and has been there for months?
So, back in the day I used to run the compliance team at Cisco Systems, and my job was to gatekeep the supply chain from the engineering team and audit every single piece of third-party software that came through, and that was also used for more automated vulnerability checking. But yeah, when you start looking at what you can get when you're using Node, and a quick npm, I'll add this module, and
it spirals.
Modules comes with it.
Yeah.
Then you've got a little bit of a problem on your hand in terms of doing what we're doing. So.
Absolutely. I have to maintain an asset register at work. I've got an audit starting tomorrow, so the timing of this is really good. And one of the things they want is to see the asset register. Now, when they did their audit last year, the asset register had gone a couple of years into dust. It did not exist. So oddly enough, we got a bad mark for that. Whereas this year, it exists. Is it complete? Might have to black that one out of the recording. No, it will not be complete, because actually having a complete asset register is a nightmare. And I have worked places where people have come up to me and said, oh, you need to clear out your other office. And I'm going, what other office? What are you on about? Only to find that there was another office that I didn't know I owned, and it still had stuff in it. So you do find that things come out of the woodwork, and like you say, software assets are another whole world of pain entirely, and someone will just add something in. I know a lot of us here are developers, and I'm sure we're all guilty of it. You pull in one package, it pulls in loads of other stuff. You probably haven't checked it, I know I haven't, and it goes from there. So tracking the vulnerabilities and then the risks associated with them is a massive body of work. But we've got to do it in order to keep our risk down, and that means we have to have an idea of what we've got. So there are tools that can help us do that. It's not just looking at the pretty graphs occasionally that the tools spit out, and they do spit out some nice pretty graphs, and some people in organisations love to look at them and see where the line goes. But unless you interpret that line, it doesn't really help you. So that's really why we want to run it. We want to fix the first stage of ignorance, not knowing what we don't know. We are using the vulnerability management program to identify what have we got, what are the problems that it brings us, and basically keeping an eye on it and seeing how we can reduce that risk or how we can fix it. If you've got a compliance team, so this is where you'll have come in, they're going to love it, because all of a sudden you're giving them something tangible to hold on to. They might hate the answers, but it's something that they can work with in order to work out how they're doing. It'll help your IT security team, which is a lot of my job is sitting there going, oh my goodness, this big thing has happened. Has anybody seen the VMware problems that have just popped up? It's sufficiently bad that VMware are releasing patches for unsupported systems. So it's not quite bad, it's their remote administration protocol. So if you don't know that you've got that thing in the organisation, you can't fix it. So by having a vulnerability management program, your compliance and your security teams are ahead of the game. They can start putting plans in place to avoid the disaster before it strikes. And a lot of my job, which is where the customer request comes in, if you ask my wife what I do, she will tell you that I answer security questionnaires and that is it. Because I get so many of them from banks and customers and sometimes the bank that works with the customer that you would probably think that is all I do. Whereas because I'm running a vulnerability management program, when they say, do you run vulnerability scans? Do you make sure you have covered this, that and the other? I can say yes, and I can evidence it. And as a result of that, the vulnerability management program helps the company that I work for keep their business. Same as hopefully when we pass the audit tomorrow. We will also be keeping that business. So there's a number of tools that we can use for this. Some of you may have used before. Tenable Nessus I used for years, and it's a very old product now, gets updated fairly regularly. But unfortunately, because they keep updating it, they also take away features that you've paid for. So you used to be able to export some really nice and helpful reports, and then they took that away. And it used to be multi-user, so you could set up everything, and then different teams could run scans. That's gone. So I had to move away from Nessus. But if you're a pen tester going to a site, you'll use Nessus almost certainly as your starting block to get from. Tenable.io is their next product up, and it costs a lot more money, and it's charged by the thing you scan, whereas Nessus you can scan as many things as you like, when you could last I use it. Rapid7 Insight VM, that's what I'm using now. Hello, Alex.
What's the difference in price between the two?
So Nessus, when I last looked at a quote for it, you could get a single user license for £2,000.
Okay.
Which is quite a lot if you're a one-person outfit, but actually it's quite cost-effective because you can use it as many times as you like. Tenable.io, that £2,000 might buy you an instance in the cloud, which is where it has to be, and then maybe, if you're lucky, 100 things to scan. Those, I can't give you definite prices, but £2,000 with Tenable.io is not going to get you very far. Rapid7 Insight VM, 250 things nodes to scan is about £6,000. So the costs are still high, But if it's that or tens of thousands for Tenable.io, I'm afraid that one forced my hand. So Insight VM, there'll be some screenshots of that in a bit, and that's what I use at least once a week as part of my working through this program. I will log in, I'll have a look at what it's telling me, I'll then go and log some tickets for somebody to go and fix things. Qualys VMDR I haven't used, but Qualys are a very reputable company as well. I'm sure there'll be some good information there. AWS Security Hub, if you're using Amazon's services, you can enable Security Hub and it will sit there and scan everything that you use and then say you've got an S3 bucket that anybody can write to, or you haven't turned on multi-factor authentication for this. And it will sit there and look at your configuration and find all your configuration problems and then give you a big long list, which you can't export without a Lambda function. But you get a nice big list and then you can go and work through that. JetBrains Kadana will look at vulnerabilities in your code, so it's a static analysis tool. And Dependency Track will look at your code again, but it will sit there and you've got this version of a library, that's vulnerable. And there are loads of things. There's things like SonarQube as well, which will look at your code and find vulnerabilities in the code. So it depends what you're working on. I do a lot of infrastructure type scanning, so I'm sort of sitting in the top set and a bit of Security Hub as we're moving more cloudy. The developers that I work with, they're sitting looking at the code side of things. But vulnerability management covers everything, including, if you like, those proverbial locks on the door. So a section that I added today, as I realised for our audit tomorrow, I also had to talk about this, is where do you get your information from in order to actually talk about and manage your vulnerabilities? So you might have the output from the scans. You normally pay at least a yearly maintenance fee on those scans, so you'll get some definition updates. And they'll tell you, or tell the software what the latest issue is and you can find it. It might be that actually you have a researcher contact you and says, hello, found a problem on your site or with your software, and they'll expect you to do something. And if you want to see what happened for me on that one, go and have a look at the talk in September, because I talk about that. It might equally be that you follow some researchers and their blogs. And Twitter, I'm not calling it that other thing, Twitter is full of security researchers, although that is dropping, who will say, I found this thing. You've got to be a bit careful with that kind of research, see if other people are seeing the same thing, but generally it's not a bad shout in order to see what's going on. It might be a vendor report, where somebody goes and publishes and says, right, there is this big vulnerability fix coming, but we're not going to tell you about it yet because we want you to patch first. Or it might be they're going, the whole world is on fire, patch now. And then you find out what it's about. Or it might be that you get a report from a concerned citizen where they've gone and found something. So not necessarily a research, but they found something that's not quite right and they report it to you and you've got to look at it. So all of that you can feed into your program. And I'm sure there is a tool somewhere that will allow you to aggregate all of that. I'm not using any of those. I just have a ticketing system and some scans. So by the time you've got all of that together, you've got some form of threat intelligence. And certainly in my case, my job is understanding that threat intelligence, seeing what it's really about, and then working out, based on what I know of the business, what we need to do. So I mentioned that I do a lot of infrastructure type stuff. What something is the infrastructure. So it could be a server, it could be a PC, it could be a piece of networking equipment. That's the sort of stuff that I'm talking about here. So it could also cover end user laptops. If you've got something like Defender or you've got loads of licenses and you want to scan your endpoints as well. That's your infrastructure type side of things. And it's going to look at whether or not it's got a good configuration on there, whether you're missing some patches, whether you've got a really old version of a VB6 application, thank you Bill, that's sat there that it knows is really vulnerable. And the system almost certainly will flag that up and it will say, you need to patch that. And it will hopefully tell you how. The good tools will tell you the steps you can take in order to fix the problem. Equally, it could be a configuration vulnerability. I mentioned the S3 bucket that anybody could write to in Amazon. Maybe you've got some extra ports open to the internet that you don't want there. Years ago, I actually had a server with Telnet running on it because that's what my friend wanted running on that server. And then a few months later, I had to break into my own server as somebody had somehow broken in through Telnet. So it will tell you if you've got Telnet rather than SSH, for example. It will look at that configuration and it will give you some advice, much the same as it would on the patching side, so that you can hopefully go away and fix it. And equally, your bad firewall setup. It can be really easy with a firewall to go and throw a rule in because we need to get this working now, and then it sits there. That temporary fix that becomes permanent. And I'm sure a lot of us have seen those. So it might spot that and highlight that to you. And then you can be the friend of everybody when you say, on this date, I'm turning this off. And people will not check, they'll just scream at you after the fact. Your code vulnerabilities, it could be not sanitizing your inputs. So somebody will send some data that will then do something bad. It might put a pop-up on the screen, if you're lucky and it's a nice benign pop-up, or it might divert your customer somewhere else. We've actually seen cases where some people have gone to one website and been diverted to that website's competitor. So you want your inputs sanitized, so things like that don't happen. It could be that outdated library, and this happens really easily, especially if you've just gone and pulled in a load of dependencies. And technical debt is a real thing. Developers will end up pulling something in. None of us have got the time to sit there and make sure that everything is absolutely up to date, because the shiny new feature, that's what makes the money, that's what's exciting. So that old library will sit there, so it will find that. You want to be looking for something that at the very least checks for the OWASP top 10 if you're looking at a software code vulnerability, because people will ask you about it, so if you can audit it and evidence it, fantastic. And ideally you want to be following a secure development practice anyway, that will hopefully encapsulate that, and you won't put out the code in a bad state to start with. Everybody's very quiet this evening. Okay.
Boo.
Thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
As long as I'm not boring everybody. People at work do think I'm a bit strange. So, they're right. Not all vulnerabilities are technical. So, I keep going on about the locks on the doors, and that's because I did a pen test once, and I could tell you the locks that the particular customer had on their doors. Oh, hello.
The best one I've heard is a hardware manufacturer shop in East London, where their whole thing was revolving around making high security products. They had their fire door propped open because it didn't have air conditioning and it would get quite hot. So they went, oh, that'll be alright.
Yeah, people propping doors open when you've got, in theory, a secure office. It's not a technical vulnerability, it's definitely a physical one. So you get that come in. So are the doors locked? Does your perimeter fence have a hole? Do you have a perimeter fence? Rather difficult if you're in a co-working space or you're in a multi-tenanted office. You're not really going to be able to put a fence around your little office in the middle of a block. People will definitely look at you funnily. Do you leave information out overnight? So some of you might have clear desk policies at work. And in theory, we do. But in practice, if you go in early to audit what's happening, you will find people have left things on their desk. And it might just be somebody's to-do list where they're saying, oh, I need to do this tomorrow. Or it might be a list of everybody in the company that's going to a particular event, at which point potentially you've got a data breach if that gets stolen by somebody who comes in. Equally, it could be the key plans for your new product, which you don't want somebody getting hold of. So a clear desk policy is a good way of trying to cut down some of the physical vulnerability you might suffer. It is generally the cleaners that get the first suspicion in these cases, because they're not, in theory, they're the easiest ones to bribe. So you've got to be careful when you're leaving stuff out. Our cleaners, I don't think, would have any interest at all in stealing what's left on our desks.
My favourite one of those was the company I worked in had a shoebox next to the accounting department where the receipts from the credit card.
I know where you're going.
And they didn't even have obscure plans on them, so they were just people's credit card in a shoebox
And sitting there.
next to the accounting people. It was brilliant. It was only what, 4 years ago.
Yeah, and the silly thing is, PCI DSS rules say you cannot have the whole card number on a receipt. Shouldn't ever be there. But these systems still print them.
Yeah.
And
This was from a card machine.
Yeah, it will be there.
Obscure plans.
And what my former boss used to do is when the shop takes off the receipt that they go and put in their till and then goes to give him his, he would say, can I have the other one? Like, are you charging me twice? What's going on? So he used to get them to swap them over. So in theory, it shouldn't really happen because things should be catching up. But yeah, the shoebox with receipts, I've been places and seen exactly the same. Or the basket under the till, not even a shoebox, just a random basket. So again, you've got another vulnerability there. And are you leaving passwords on display? Does anybody sit there with their laptop encryption password written on their wrist rest? Because IT set it and it's horrible to type in. Because I've been there and I've seen it, and we had a load of laptops stolen one place I worked, and I just sat there and thought, oh no, I bet they'll have got some passwords on those wrist rests. There's nothing you can do by the time the asset's out of your hands. That was a few years ago. But unfortunately, it's also the military that have problems. So this was, hang on, Prince, that's William, isn't it? He went, and there was a big interview set, I think it was a documentary, talking about what he does. And the original photo, this one has been blurred out, but the original photo, they're sat there happily talking, and on that white piece of paper at the top was a bunch of passwords for whatever mill flip is. I have no idea. I've taken this photo from somewhere else. Somebody very kindly had a copy online that wasn't completely redacted. So we could see that it was on there. And if you're in a safe working environment, you can do things like that. You can put your secrets on display for everybody that should have it. But realistically, it's not always your people in the building, especially if you're in a multi-tenanted space. If you go to a co-working space and you borrow a meeting room and you've ever walked in and there's all this stuff on the whiteboard or on the flip chart because somebody hasn't taken it, well, that's a vulnerability that you need to allow for, or somebody does.
A friend of mine who does security, the first thing he always used to do with clients when he walked when he was left alone in the meeting room, was just plug into the nearest Ethernet port and see what happened.
Yep. Exposed network ports are a pain. One place I worked, I had an alert come through because somebody had caused a loop. So the whole network, in theory, would have shut down at that point. And I ran over there. This guy I'd spoken to for months but never met. Like, who are you and what are you doing with that phone? Because he'd done it via a phone. And it was great. I actually got to meet the guy I'd been speaking to for months, but it was a bit of an awkward conversation. So, looking at the infrastructure side of things, and you can do this with an active web scan when you're talking to a website, but just focusing on infrastructure. Your unauthenticated scan is what your attacker is generally going to be starting with. So they don't have a username and password for the system. Essentially, if you're scanning like that, you are going to get what they would see. So it's not a bad place to start. And literally, you'll point your tool at something and say, go and scan that, tell me what you see. And in that mode, you won't necessarily see much detail. You'll just get perhaps, oh, it's a Windows machine. Oh, it's a Linux machine. It's got a web server running on it. Alternatively, you can do an authenticated scan. And that's where you give it a set of credentials, and the tool is going to log in to the server that it's scanning, or the switch that it's scanning, or whatever the equipment is, and it's going to interrogate it in a lot more depth. And it's going to say, what programs have you got installed? What patches are on here? What can you tell me about what you do? At which point your details get your results get really, really detailed. And you really get down to the file versions that are installed. So if ever you've installed a Microsoft patch, there's an article that goes with each patch, and it will tell you the file versions that are in that patch. So you can check if you really want to, did it install okay? So the tool will actually do the same thing. And it'll go, okay, what version of this DLL are you running? Oh, it's a bad one. Or it will look at the registry on Windows, and it will say, okay, you're missing a registry key. You've installed the patch, great, well done. It's not going to do anything until you put this registry key in there. But unless you're running a scan, you won't know, because somebody's installed the patch. As far as their system's concerned, it's up to date. It's only when you go and run some vulnerability scanning tools that you see a bit more detail. So when you run a scan, you could either run a discovery scan, so you can try and see what's there. I found a Hue light bulb on our network through one of these. I still haven't found physically the light bulb, but I know that it's there. So you'll run your discovery scan, you'll get a nice long list, and you'll say, okay, I've got 300 things on the network. And then you can run a vulnerability scan and say, okay, now go and talk to those things properly. Find out what's really there. So you might be thinking at this point, isn't that a penetration test? And they do overlap a lot. And certainly, as I said earlier, if you've got somebody who comes in to run a test for you, one of the first things your tester is likely to do is plug into your network and run an ESSA scan to find out what you've got, to see what's going on. But they're not quite the same. So with a penetration test, you shouldn't really be getting somebody to disable protections, because that's the whole point. You're testing with a penetration test the system in its entirety. If you're running a vulnerability scan, it's okay to disable things like your web application firewall or whatever is going to sit there in the middle, because what you're doing with a vulnerability scan is finding out the worst case scenario. So what happens if somebody gets through all of this protection that I've put in the way and gets to the squidgy bit in the middle? That is really the difference here. Still boggles the mind when I have a third party say, can you turn off your web application firewall? We want to do a penetration test. It's not really what you're doing. But they get very aggy if you don't do it. So we then have a bit of a conversation about the differences and they have to put a note in their report. So a vulnerability assessment allows you to see what is the worst case scenario, which is where you don't want to be. So there's some screenshots coming up and then there is the break. So hopefully I haven't put you to sleep. Different products will show things in different ways. These are from Rapid7's Insight VM product. Used to be Nexpose. I'm not on commission. It's just what I'm using at the moment. So the first screenshot will show us what an asset overview looks like. Then we'll look at some detected vulnerabilities, an example host report, and then a fourth screenshot is for a site that is going to be decommissioned soon. So we can see some of the idea of the sort of stuff that it has. So you can tell this isn't mine because I don't have 5 million licenses for this product. So this has come from their website. So this is just a nice overview that somebody who has not necessarily lots of technical knowledge can look at, get an idea of what's going on. So you'll be able to see what's been discovered, what's been assessed, so you can see if you're actually managing to scan things properly, your operating systems, and importantly, and interestingly, how exploitable something is. If it's exploitable by anybody with no experience, that'll be the novice category. You really don't want those. If it's something that an expert would need to sit there and poke away at to get in, it's probably worse, but the chance goes down. And if there's no known exploit, that's where you want to be. Somebody knows there's a vulnerability in this piece of code, but there's no way to get to it. It never runs. And then just looking at a particular host, so we've now got a breakdown of CVSS scores. So I mentioned earlier that there were numbers involved, but I don't calculate them myself. The CVSS sits there, it's the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, and it will go, okay, because this is accessible from the public internet and you don't need to log into it and you can execute any code you like and a bunch of other metrics, it will come through and it will give you a number, 10 being the worst. You do not want a 10, and I have a feeling that VMware one I mentioned is a 10 or a 9.8. So it's sitting up there in a really bad area. And then you get a list of the things that are on the machine, or whatever you've scanned, and how you then need to go and deal with it. So default telnet password, admin password still happens. You'd really hope by now that it didn't. It considers that a CVSS 10, the worst thing possible, and it will have calculated that because as soon as somebody gets to this device, they can just log in, because it'll be on a list. And there's some other bits and pieces. These are all 10s, it's the top of the list. But you've got checks there to see if a database is installed and things like that. You might sit there looking at the report that shows how your risk is over time, and this one is going up, which is not what you want to be happening. You want your risks to be coming down. But importantly for me in this tool are these columns here, which tells me if there is something that is susceptible to a malware attack, if there's an exploit, if it's in a particular exploit kit. So it's those details that I will take and I will then use that to prioritise what I'm getting the teams to fix. Because if no one's got an exploit for it, I'm less worried. And then the site that I'm going to kill. As you can see, there's some old stuff here. We've got some Server 2008 R2 going on. And there are 1,494 vulnerabilities there, and this product will give it an arbitrary score based on how many things there are and their severity. So that one asset alone is sitting at 536 risk points, 1,000 risk points in their system. The worst one I saw was 1 and a bit million for one server, which was quite a shock to the system. But it will sit there, so because it was an authenticated scan, it's worked out what version of Windows it is, what version of Linux, it's worked out what the problems are, and it's come through and given us that kind of chart. There's some bits I've blacked out because that would help you work out a bit more about what was there. But that's the sort of information that you get at a very high level. So, as I said, we've got the nice pint time. After we've come back and we've had a bit of chill time, we'll have a look at some of the ways that you can determine how for your organisation do you take that information and distill it into something actionable, so you only do the really bad things first and not what it tells you are the bad things. So, Reg.